Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to a special Milim presentation, which forms part of a series of events under the banner Leeds Remembers 7th of October. Welcome whether you are in Leeds, elsewhere in the UK, or indeed anywhere else in the world. This evening, we welcome back Professor Rosa Freedman, and I'll introduce Rosa after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you would like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. There's also a chat facility on your screen, and you can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event. It will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Rosa Freedman is the inaugural Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading. She received her LLB, LLM and PhD from the University of London and is a non-practicing barrister and a member of the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. Her research focuses on the UN and on human rights, subjects she has published extensively about. Rosa is a visiting fellow at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and the co-editor of the Routledge book series on this subject. Her topic this evening is United Nations, Israel and the 2nd of October. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Rosa Freedman. Rosa.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Alan, for inviting me back again tonight. And I think we can't really start this evening without just having a moment to reflect on why we're here and why this series of events is happening this week. Certainly, the world changed for me and for all of us a year ago. None of us knew at 8:03 p.m. on the 6th of October quite what was coming around the corner, and none of us want this week of events to be happening, or indeed this year to have occurred. It's a time when, as one of the students said in response to a survey we did recently of students on campus, that they've never felt less protected as a Jew, but they've also never felt less alone. And it's a time when our community globally and nationally and locally has come together in ways that perhaps people of my generation, certainly that have been raised in the privilege of a liberal democracy that protects its Jews, had never thought was needed or would be possible. But I really hope that by the time we wake up tomorrow, there'll be an end to the war and the hostages will have returned home to their families. I don't believe it will happen, but I think we have to live in hope. And a friend of mine said to me this evening, or wrote to me this evening, that she'd heard this little words of Torah. Why was it that Miriam grabbed her tambourine when she ran? What is it about music that gives us hope? And I think there is something really strong about music. It certainly evokes feelings and emotions in us and allows us to connect into hope and also to sadness in a way that is really important in these times of darkness and what often feels like silence. So tonight I'm going to talk rather briefly, I think, about the United Nations, Israel and the 7th of October. And the reason I say rather briefly is I think it's a subject that I'd like to cover, but then leave open for questions, because judging by our Friday night dinner tables throughout my career, but certainly over the last year, coffees with friends, conversations with colleagues, it's an area that needs to be understood and needs to be unpacked through questions rather than through lecturing. But let me just give an overview of the UN and Israel and 7th of October. I'm a professor of law, conflict and global development, as Jonathan said, and I've spent my career working on and within the United Nations. I wrote my PhD thesis on the UN Human Rights Council when it was in its infancy. I've served on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board. I've worked with governments and with the European Parliament, and I've always been a firm believer that the United Nations is a cause for good in the world. Of course, there are many flaws to it, but it is a cause for good. And if we disbanded it tomorrow, we would not be able to replace it with anything that could deliver the kind of aid, development, and human rights that it does around the world. This time last year, I was a firm advocate for the UN, and I remain an advocate, but not a firm one. Because this time last year, I would say to people, look, yes, the UN can get things wrong about Israel, and it may appear to at times be anti-Semitic, but it's not so bad. I've changed my position since that time, and as I always say to my husband, I reserve the right always to change my position. But let me explain why. The atrocities, as we know, that were perpetrated by Hamas and its civilian supporters against Israelis and other citizens were among the worst single acts of terrorism during the UN's existence. And so it was to be expected that the UN, which is the world's only universal and global organization that's built on the principle of sovereign equality amongst all of its member states, it was expected that the UN would express solidarity with Israel, that it would condemn the terrorism, that it would speak out against the atrocities. Why was that expected? Because it would have mirrored the UN's responses to other terrorist atrocities perpetrated against UN member states around the world throughout UN's history. But it soon became apparent that that kind of solidarity was not going to be forthcoming. The UN Secretary General issued a swift 8-sentence condemnation of the attacks. But in that statement, he said that he urged all diplomatic efforts to avoid a wider conflagration. That is, instead of supporting Israel's rights to rescue her hostages and to exercise self-defense of her citizens, he already engaged in this kind of moral equivalence, this whataboutery, this urging that Israel somehow behave differently to all other states as they would do if they had had this attack perpetrated against them. Now, I heard someone recently say that proportionately, this attack would have been the equivalent of 9/11 killing more than 50,000 American citizens. I'm not a statistician and I don't know, but what we do know is that there's 9 million Israelis and 1,200 of them were slaughtered on that day. That is a very large minority to be killed in a terrorist atrocity on one single day. Soon after that time, the UN General Assembly, which is the place where all 193 member states took no action whatsoever. In fact, they took 20 days to pass a resolution. And when they did, those 193 member states failed even to condemn Hamas for the atrocities, and instead used that text to focus on Israel's response. The Security Council, which is the UN's main body that deals with peace and security in the world, first discussed the atrocities a week after they occurred. Now, the UN Security Council meets regularly, often on the weekend, often at last minute, because its job is to deal with instant and grave crises, and therefore it has to be agile and flexible. We have seen time and again when Israel recently, allegedly, blew up pages in Lebanon, that the UN Security Council met almost instantaneously to discuss whether or not there was a law around booby trapping and what could be done or could not be done in that context. But it took a week for them to meet. And even then, it was in the context of Russia proposing a resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. A ceasefire bearing in mind that Israel had not yet entered Gaza, had not yet carried out a single act that has led to what we must acknowledge is a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. And in that first meeting of the UN Security Council, talking about that Russian resolution, the Security Council did not once condemn Hamas for the atrocities on 7th of October. Now, this pattern continued time and again at those bodies, the General Assembly, the Security Council, at the UN Human Rights Council, within the UN funds, programs, and agencies. Of particular shame, which I think many of us know about, is that UN Women took 8 weeks to condemn the gender-based and sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls by Hamas and the others, many of whom were civilians, who joined in to rape and slaughter women and girls and some men on the 7th of October. Now, to those of us who know the history of the UN in Israel, these responses were not surprising. On some levels, they were to be expected. Since its creation, the State of Israel has been subjected to a serious amount of politicization, attacks, and attempts to undermine it as a sovereign nation from all parts of the UN. It has been othered by its peers as a sovereign state in much the same way that Jews have been othered as a people. And this is where I try to explain, when I'm working with people from the UN, with governments, talking to students or anyone, what anti-Semitism is in the context of Israel. If anti-Semitism is treating Jews as different to all other people, then anti-Semitism where it comes to Israel is not criticism of Israel. We should criticize all countries because all countries get things wrong all of the time. Anti-Semitism is when Israel is treated so differently to other states that it is othered. And in particular, when there are calls to delegitimize Israel, to remove it from the United Nations, to erase it as a sovereign state, because that is denying Jews the right to their own homeland, while telling all other peoples that they have this right of self-determination, to choose who governs over them and to be a people in their own state. And that is what we saw as a direct result of 7th of October. Instead of UN member states coming out in solidarity and supporting Israel's right to defend her territory, to rescue her citizens, and to have security for those who remained alive, instead we saw states time and again seeking to delegitimize Israel as a state, to claim that she did not have the right to defend her own civilians, and to other her within the context of the UN, including calls for her to be expelled from that body. Now, I am not one to say that Israel does not commit human rights abuses. It does. And Israel may well have committed very serious violations of the laws of war in the context of what has happened in Gaza over the past year. But when we look at the other wars going on in the world, there have not been calls for Sudan to be removed from the United Nations, for Turkey and its occupation of northern Cyprus to make it othered and removed from the UN General Assembly, or for many other similar or worse situations. Look at China and Taiwan and Tibet, for example. So treating Israel differently to those other countries becomes anti-Semitic, just like treating Jews as different to all other people is anti-Semitic. Now, over the course of the last year, I have had to try to explain quite clearly and succinctly the different parts of the UN and how their responses to 7th of October demonstrates that at the heart of the UN is anti-Semitism. But more importantly, why? There are 15 million or so Jews in a world population of about 8 billion people. That's about 0.2% of the global population. So around 7 million live in Israel, around 7 million live in America, and the rest are spread out in 96 other countries of 193 in the world. There are no countries where Jews live today where they haven't been persecuted, expelled, or killed simply for being Jewish. And that includes in the UK, where Jews only moved in about 300 or so years ago, having been expelled in the 1200s. Anti-Semitism is coded into the DNA of all countries. We don't have to know why, we don't have to understand it, but we can see it throughout history. If it is coded into all 193 members of the United Nations, then of course, those states who are the member states who govern the UN, who push the UN forward, bring their anti-Semitism into all of the UN bodies, all of the UN activities, and all of the UN programs. And we can see this in the way that unique standards are applied to Israel in ways that they're not applied to other countries, in the way that terminology is twisted and applied to Israel in ways it's not applied to other countries. But most importantly, in the denial of Israel's right to security, to self-defense, which are enshrined in the UN Charter, or even Israel's right to exist. In 1998, the UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan became the first UN Secretary-General to acknowledge these problems. He called the UN biased against Israel. He highlighted the hypocrisy and double standards, the intense scrutiny, and the fact that while other situations failed to elicit the world's outrage and condemnations, time and again focus is put on Israel. Secretary-General Kofi Annan demanded an end to anti-Semitic speech in the UN. So it wasn't just anti-Semitic actions, but actually the speech from diplomats openly in UN bodies. He said it's the only form of hate speech that has consistently persisted and been allowed to occur within the UN. Annan's successor, Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, also recognized that bias against Israel. He used his final statement on Israel and Palestine to the UN Security Council to reiterate what his predecessor had said. He talked about the decades of disproportionate volumes of resolutions, reports, conferences, and focus on Israel, as compared to many other countries in the world combined. And he emphasized that rather than helping the Palestinian cause, this had actually hampered the ability of the UN to fulfill its role effectively. But why have we got to this place? To understand the UN's relationship with Israel, it's important first to understand the United Nations. It was created in 1945, and it was created to make sure that never again there would be a world war, a war that would disrupt the peoples of all 193 member states. The UN, excuse me, the UN was created in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And within 2 years, it was already being dominated by discussions of what to do about Israel and Palestine. As many, if not all of us know, on the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution which recommended partitioning Palestine, which was a trusteeship. Right? It was not its own country, but it was held in trust, having been ruled over by various empires, including the Ottoman Turks and then the British Empire. It recommended partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem under a special regime. This followed decades of instability in the region, including waves of both Arab and Jewish immigration to the territory and competing campaigns for nationalism by both groups. However, that partition plan was not taken up. In fact, it was all but ignored. And the day that the Israelis call Yom HaAtzmaut, that the Palestinians called the Nakba, was not actually a day where the UN created two states. It was a day where the trusteeship ended and Israel declared a state. And from that moment on, the Arab countries, soon followed by the Soviet Union and other supporters, used the UN to try and delegitimize that creation of the state rather than trying to push forward the self-determination of the Palestinian people within their own state, with their own defined borders and security. Now, there are many Jews here, which means there's even many more opinions in the room. And it's not really for this talk to discuss the politics of whether or not that partition plan or subsequent resolutions should have or have not been upheld. What I want to talk about is what happened at the UN subsequently to that. Since that time, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the UN human rights bodies, and now, even more recently, the International Court of Justice, have been used as sites to try to undermine, delegitimize, or erase the state of Israel. One of the main examples that we can give of this is the Zionism is racism resolutions that occurred from the 1960s all the way through towards the 1990s. It started because there was a proposal that there should be elimination of racism within the United Nations, which sounds like a good thing. And the Americans proposed that anti-Semitism should be recognized as a form of racism. The Soviet Union at that time, which had had a resurgence of anti-Semitism within its borders, countered that proposal and said, that's absolutely fine. We will include anti-Semitism, but we also must include Zionism as a form of racism. From that moment, in the 1960s onwards, a policy was adopted in every single UN General Assembly resolution talking about racism and racial equality, that Zionism should be equated with racism. And despite many attempts to block that and to overthrow it, this moved forward throughout the 70s and throughout the 80s until that language became so much part of the discourse that we even hear it in universities today. This idea that Israel is part of white settler colonialism comes from the language in the UN of Zionism as racism, despite the fact that the majority of Jews in Israel are not white Europeans, but actually come from Arab countries, from Latin America, and other parts of the world, including African countries. The Zionism is, and if anyone's particularly interested in anything I'm talking about, I'm very happy to share the writings that I've done on this. But the Zionism is racism agenda was joined by an agenda within the human rights bodies of equating what was going on in Israel with apartheid South Africa. Now, to be very clear, there's human rights abuses in Israel, and there are occupied territories, occupied Palestinian territories and occupied Syrian territories under Israeli control. But to equate these with the language of apartheid, again, tries to evoke this idea of white settler colonialism and this easy binary between Europeans and everyone else in the world. This equation of trying to draw a moral equivalence between European Jews who had just come out of the Holocaust and landed, often had to fight their way in underground into Israel, with the types of European settlers that arrived on the shores in countries like Haiti and slaughtered all of the local population. The drawing of some form of moral equivalence between Israel and South Africa and the apartheid regime, again, was so drawn out within the human rights bodies that we still hear that language in universities today, often from people who do not understand or know the history of where those agendas were first drawn out. And many of the countries that were pushing this forward, many of the countries that were pushing this forward were themselves perpetrating forms of racism, intolerance, and subjugation within their own states. Not only the Soviet Union and China, but countries like Cuba, where you wouldn't have wanted to be LGBT, and many others, where there were very specific forms of oppression that were going on within their own national territories. Excuse me. As the world moved on through the Cold War and towards the end of the Cold War, many of these agendas were pushed out with this new movement towards an interdependent, indivisible, changing new world order in the 1990s. But the anti-Semitism in the UN did not get pushed out. Instead, it just simply morphed to change along with the changing times. And another big case study that many people will have heard of was the Durban Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia, which was held in 2001. It was actually the Third World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, but often just simply known as Durban. That conference was supposed to be held about challenging racism in all of its forms, but it was very swiftly overtaken by people who are not just anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, but simply anti-Semitic. In the week prior to that conference, civil society were invited in, as they ought to be, because the UN is about we the peoples, not just about they the states. And the civil society or the NGO forum was held. It was hijacked by people who simply were using it for anti-Semitic purposes. And I don't use that word lightly. There were posters with swastikas over the Star of David, which adorned the walls of the cricket stadium where that forum was held. Participants wore T-shirts saying apartheid Israel on one side and racism, colonialism, and apartheid on the other. Pamphlets were there with classic anti-Semitic stereotypes and blood libels. There was a handbill with a picture of Hitler, which simply stated, "What if I had won? The good things. There would be no Israel and no Palestinian bloodshed," and many, many more examples. It was so bad that the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, ordered the official US delegation to return home because the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic agendas were so extreme. He said, "I know that you do not combat racism by conferences that produce declarations containing hateful language, some of which is a throwback to the Zionism is racism days, or which supports that we have made too much of the Holocaust." This is 2001. At this point, I'm still at university. But I can tell you from my experience of the United Nations, and particularly of the UN human rights bodies, but also of working with humanitarian delivery, including more recently working on UNRWA, but also working within peacekeeping and elsewhere, that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment still takes hold. Their excessive scrutiny of Israel, the overemphasis and focus of what goes on in Israel so that there is not enough time to look at the many human rights abuses elsewhere, has absolutely prevailed at the UN Human Rights Council, which was created in 2006 and which has simply continued what its predecessor did in terms of that excessive scrutiny. The fact that UNRWA exists as the only humanitarian refugee agency in the world outside of UNHCR. The global UN Human Rights Refugee Agency deals with all refugees in the world, but UNRWA exists specifically to focus on the Palestinians and on Israel. The fact that there are so many UN special rapporteurs and independent experts, ranging from housing to leprosy, who have decided to make statements about what's going on in Gaza, rather than focusing on their own mandates, because as far as I know, there are no cases of leprosy in Gaza, but there are many cases of leprosy elsewhere. All of this excessive focus and shifting the spotlight onto Israel says to me that the UN still has an anti-Semitism problem. Now, I hold firm to the belief that without the UN, the world would be a much poorer place. The UN delivers food and aid, water and sanitation, development, and many other things around the world that the people simply wouldn't have access to if it wasn't for the UN. And at the same time, since 7th of October, I have realized just how strongly the UN has not just an anti-Israel bias, but an anti-Semitism problem. And if we can't name the problem, we can't understand the problem, and we can't address the problem. And that, I suppose, is what my talk and my writing have been about over the past year, and I'm happy to take any questions on this.
Well, thank you, Rosa, for that fascinating insight into the workings of the United Nations. You've outlined a wide range of subjects we could talk about, and I do hope our audience engage, and I do encourage people to ask questions now by typing whatever they'd like to ask into the Q&A. If I heard you rightly, you said that war crimes had been committed in Gaza. Would you elaborate a bit, because there are wild accusations of war crimes, which apparently have been debunked. What's going on there that is problematic?
I really don't think I said war crimes. I think I specifically shied away from using any international criminal law terminology. I said, I'm sure we can look it back up, but I think I said that Israel has violated international law, or used
Okay,
a phrase.
my apologies. Okay.
No, it's fine. It's the very specific terminologies. Accusations of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes are bandied around far too frequently, in my opinion. We cannot know whether such atrocities were committed until long after a war has ended and investigations have happened. And in many ways, the decision to pursue claims of genocide at the International Court of Justice have done a disservice to everyone involved, because there is no obvious evidence, say, of genocide. I will come back to your question. I'm just answering it in a circular way. There is no obvious evidence of genocide, but now by the South Africans and others telling the Palestinians who support this case that they're pursuing genocide. If the court finds, which seems likely, that there is not grounds for genocide, then no matter what the court finds, those victims or survivors of atrocities will feel hard done by and feel that they weren't given that sort of strapline, that label of genocide. So I try very, very clearly to stay away from labels. In wars, atrocities happen. I was raised by people who were vehement members of the campaign against nuclear disarmament. I believe let's just end war. It's a great hope. Probably won't happen. Urban conflict, as some of my colleagues who have been in armies and who are military experts, urban conflict is the hardest to carry out and carries the most casualties for soldiers, while also minimizing casualties on the ground. But that doesn't mean that the ways in which this war has been waged in Gaza has not had atrocities, and it has not all been urban conflict. I think that we should leave those discussions to military experts, and probably until after the war and after investigators have gone in. But the sheer number of casualties and the damage caused, people are saying that people who have the expertise are saying it will be at least 10 years after the war before Gaza is inhabitable again. Most of the buildings need to be pulled down. The first thing that happens is kids need to go to school. For kids to go to school, people need to come out of the school buildings and move into tents and shelters. Kids go to school so that parents can go and look for work or just try and rebuild their lives. There will be an awful lot of rebuilding that needs to happen in that small region. And that can only happen once the war is fully over, because countries and donors will not fund it if there is a possibility that military struggle will happen again and reduce it back to rubble. So there will be violations of international law, because there always are in war, and also because we know that if we look at analogies, when the Allied troops went into Mosul and Raqqa to fight against ISIS, we know that there are violations of international law. When there are fights against all sorts of terrorist organizations, whether it's Boko Haram, whether it's the Janjaweed, there are violations of international law. And I don't think that we can shy away from that and think that anyone can wage a war and do it with clean hands.
You mentioned UNRWA. We have a question from Malcolm Taylor. Should UNRWA be disbanded as its education program is so anti-Semitic? And are they actually fulfilling their role as helping refugees, as the original refugees are actually remnants of an older generation, the present generation as citizens of the West Bank or of Gaza?
So UNRWA is a really difficult and complicated one, and yet so simple. It's something I've spoken about at the Knesset, something I've spoken about with various states that are donors to UNRWA. UNRWA was created at a time when there was a huge refugee crisis going on in Europe. Remember that you had millions upon millions of displaced persons after the Second World War looking to get back to their countries or to never go back to their countries, depending on who was in charge. And the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, had not yet been created. There was no refugee convention, and that no one knew what to do with these displaced persons. At the same time, there was the 1948 war, and there was huge displacement, first of all, of Palestinians, second of all, of Jews from Arab lands also being displaced. The UN basically turned around to the Middle East and said, look, that's your problem. We're dealing with Europe. And the UN set up UNHCR, the Refugee Convention, and then the United Nations Refugee Agency. But they also set up, and it says it in the mandate of UNRWA, this very small UN Relief and Works Agency to deal with, for a short period of time, the displaced people or the refugees within the Middle East. And they called it the Palestine question, but it wasn't limited to Palestinians. It actually also included at that time Jews or anyone else displaced by what had happened in 1948. And it said very clearly that it was to be handed over to the regional states, to the neighbors of Israel, Israel and Palestine, to deal with this after a short period of time. That never happened. And my argument is that, and many other people's arguments who are cleverer than me, is that UNRWA actually has become a symbol of Palestinian nationalness. It's become a symbol of the Palestinian cause. 97 or 98% at last counting of UNRWA staff are themselves Palestinians. They operate in the occupied Palestinian territories, Syria, I mean, just about these days, given what's going on there, Lebanon and Jordan, West Bank and Gaza. So any Palestinian living there can come under UNRWA, but a Palestinian living in America with dual citizenship does not come under UNRWA. UNRWA doesn't just employ these people as teachers. They employ them as road sweepers and emptying dustbins, and as a civil service and administration, as a welfare state, as social and housing. And essentially, UNRWA is the Palestinian state in waiting for the state to be created. UNRWA, according to its own surveys, as well as outside ones, is more trusted by Palestinians than any Palestinian faction is trusted. And as we know, there are big differences in UNRWA schools, whether they're in Jordan, whether they're in Lebanon or in Gaza, in terms of the education that's given. But the education is at a much higher level than, say, education in displaced persons camps in Somalia, because it's being provided by the people to the people, often with, as we know, propaganda, sometimes terrorism embedded into it. But the problem about UNRWA is it is not neutral. Now, my father says to me, nothing is neutral in this world, but the UN has a neutrality principle. It's not supposed to take sides in a war, which is why the UN can sometimes bribe militia in order to get aid through, because it's not supposed to take a view on the conflict. It's just supposed to deliver the aid or deliver whatever the work is that's mandated to do. But if 97 or 98% of UNRWA staff are Palestinian, and it's become a symbol or a brand of the Palestinian cause, then we can see that it's no longer neutral. And we can see that whether it's from its education, whether it's from the fact that UNRWA staff were part of and proven to be part of the atrocities on 7th of October, or many other things. It's time for UNRWA to be disbanded, but it can only be disbanded if there are other ways of providing humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, like we would provide to anyone that doesn't have water, sanitation, food, or healthcare. The problem is that quite early on into these discussions, when donors said they would no longer give money to UNRWA, the UN Secretary General banned all other humanitarian organizations under the UN umbrella from delivering those services, because he didn't want to see UNRWA disbanded. And one of the problems is that if UNRWA was disbanded, who else would be trusted by all parties, including Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan as states, to deliver these services? These are discussions that need to be had, because UNRWA can't continue in the form that it is. But nothing can change until the war ends. And that's where discussions are important. But the end of the war is what will see the material change on the ground.
Now, it's interesting that you say UNRWA is sort of the government in waiting, but Gaza has not been occupied for some number of years. So why were they not performing that function? What were they waiting for?
It depends how you use the term occupation. So the legal term of occupation would say that Gaza was occupied. Who occupied it might be separate, but the Gazans and whether it was a democratically elected government or a dictatorship, but those in charge of Gaza did not prior to 7th of October control the land, sea, or airspace. Right? They might have controlled the tunnels, but they did not control those aspects that would allow for a territory to be autonomous. Now, some argue that Egypt was part of this, others argue that Israel security and right of self-defense, enabled it to limit that autonomy. But non-occupied goes beyond just being in control of what happens within your land. It's also about the ability to move outside, whether it's territorial waters, whether it's airspace and having an airport, whether it's land borders and so on. So I think it's probably going a little bit beyond the scope of this talk to get into that, because it probably requires an entire talk on what occupation is or isn't, and how we understand occupation, not only in the context of Gaza or Palestine, but also in terms of Cyprus, Western Sahara, Kurdish regions, many, many places that are occupied in different forms, and what occupation looks like in the modern day.
We have a question about the USA. Our viewer believes the USA is the major funder of the UN. Does that increase its influence, and should it be reducing its financial support?
So the UN is funded by contributions from member states according to their GDP. So the higher the GDP, the more that they contribute, and that's to the regular funds of the UN. That, if we think that, and my figures are probably about 5 years out here, so forgive me, but the last time I looked it up, the NHS costs about $220 billion to run in this country. The UN's regular budget is something like 5 billion, and its peacekeeping budget is 7 billion, and that's the different contributions towards that. Some countries contribute peacekeepers, some contribute money, some contribute nothing. And then there are loads of voluntary contributions. So all those adverts that you see, UNICEF donate £5 a month, you're actually a contributor to the UN. So there are many, many budgets, and states might ring fence money. Bill Gates, a few years ago, ring fenced money to the World Health Organization that was only to be used for polio and not for combating any other health issue and so forth. So there's huge sums of money, but the regular budget is funded proportionately according to GDP. So yes, you might say that the USA is the biggest funder in terms of numbers, but in terms of GDP, we would expect it to be providing far more than, say, the Marshall Islands or Tuvalu. That being said, there's always a backlog. I don't remember ever seeing a time when there weren't arrears from states. And the US has withheld funding before, where it's been cross with things that the UN has done. But I think you have to see it as a proportion rather than as absolute dollars in the bank.
Do you think the behavior of the US is influenced in a malign manner because there's an election coming? Do you think they might be behaving differently were that not the case?
It's difficult to know. So we send out, the UK sent, sorry, to those who aren't in the UK, we send out diplomats who are essentially civil servants, and they follow whatever government is in place of the day. The US sends out political appointments as their diplomats, which changes with each government. And in this kind of period of time, there's always a little bit of a lull, because those who are in place are either going to go out in a blaze of glory, or they're trying to think about maybe can they keep their jobs, or at least the jobs of their staff below them. I'm not an expert in US politics, but certainly there are different ways that different diplomats behave depending on how their systems work. There's also a real reckoning at the moment in terms of the balance of power in the UN. There have been discussions recently about, there's always discussions about should we reform the Security Council. There are 5 countries that have permanent seats there. They're the 5 countries that defeated Nazi Germany: France, the US, the UK, Russia, and China. It wasn't just those countries, it was also the empires that defeated Nazi Germany. There have been serious reform discussions recently about having 2 permanent African members, and then France suddenly got cold feet because it thought it might have to give up its seat. So there's all sorts of balance of powers issues going on within the UN that have got nothing to do with what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And it's difficult at any given point to know what thing is tipping what over the edge.
Deborah Pearlman is interested in the recent missile attack by Iran on Israel, and what is the UN's response to that?
I'm not sure that the UN has really had a response to it. The September, which is, the time of starting school, starting university year, also happens to be the time of starting the UN General Assembly session. I'm sure it's linked to harvest festivals or something, but I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure anyone knows why. We call it the UNGA session. It's when the high-level diplomats or delegates go to the UN General Assembly, often prime ministers or presidents or foreign ministers. There's often an argument about whether or not the US should give a visa to someone from Iran who is busy having a rally calling for the death to America, but then demands the right to come to New York to the UN. But that's the nature of diplomacy. My understanding is this has been the most difficult UNGA session for decades. Not helped by the knowledge of Iran threatening to and then carrying out the threat, threatening to since many things that Israel's done, but threatening to bomb or send ballistics to Israel, as we saw many delegates walked out of UNGA, the UN General Assembly, when Netanyahu got up to speak. As we saw, President Zelensky from Ukraine was absolutely furious because UNGA was hijacked, in his view, not in my view, but he talked about it being hijacked by Israel-Palestine when the war against Russia has been going on for so long and has had such serious and devastating consequences. The UN doesn't hold that much sway over Iran. The organization that really does is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has 54, 55 members, member of 193 countries in the world, almost all of whom are Muslim majority countries. Until 2016, Iran really ran the OIC. Then Saudi Arabia challenged it for the leadership and won. And since that time, Iran has been more and more marginalized and sidelined. Even after Israel went in on the ground in Gaza, I think around the 23rd of October, maybe the 27th of October of last year, Iran tried to call for the OIC to take action, and the OIC said no, that they gave verbal action, but they weren't going to take military action. Many have said that the OIC are the only ones who could contain Iran or dissuade Iran, but even they have very little say. Iran has very much surrounded itself by these proxy terrorist organizations, which Israel is dismantling. And that is causing great concern amongst the UN because Iran doesn't have that many allies. It's yet to be clear whether Russia holds any sway over it or whether China will even step in as a so-called ally. But sometimes when a state has no allies, as we've seen with North Korea, it can act, or very few allies. North Korea obviously has China to some extent. It can actually make it go more rogue than if it has countries that can rein it in. So it's not so much can the UN rein in Iran or deal with it, it's actually can anyone. Sorry, that's not a very helpful answer, but it's the best I've got.
We have a connected question from Savile Pelmont, who says, is there any evidence of bias in the UN being down to the fact that a large percentage of countries have a Muslim majority?
It's not that there's a large percentage of countries in the UN that have a Muslim majority. Somewhere between a quarter and a third at most. I think it comes back to what I said earlier, that almost all countries have anti-Semitism coded into their DNA. And anti-Semitism comes out in a triangle. You've got the far right, fascists, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism that we all know and understand. It's the most obvious one. You've got the liberal left fascist anti-Semitism, and you've got the radical Islamist anti-Semitism. There is a link up between the three of them. My grandfather, Oliver Shalom, would say that when there's an economic downturn or times are tough in the world, anti-Semitism, rises, but it rises from all three of those parts of the triangle. He didn't quite say it in that way. It's easy to hate the Jews, especially at bad times. It's It's obvious the radical Islamist anti-Semitism, although many of its roots come from the Soviet Union and come from Ceausescu's Romania and other places. It's obvious the far-right fascist anti-Semitism, but the pernicious liberal left, and when I say liberal left, I mean the sort of fascist far left anti-Semitism has this veneer of legitimacy which pervades the UN in the same way it pervades civil service or pervades universities or other places. It's when they two, let alone three of them, link up together that we have to worry. And that's what we've been seeing at the UN over recent years.
We have a question from Gillian Freedman. I think you might know her. Do you have any ideas for reforming the UN to remove the widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias?
Hi, Mum. No, I don't. That is my mum asking the question. No, I don't. I think that we have to name a problem. As feminists said, we have to name what sexual harassment is to understand it, to address it. We have to name the problem. We have to use our research and our expertise and our knowledge to uncover what's going on, not in a sensationalist way, but in a way that provides the information needed to then address and tackle the problem. There are organizations that have been covering this for many years. There's the Jacob Blaustein Institute for Human Rights, there's UN Watch, there's others, if I don't name them, I'm sorry, who have been looking at various aspects of what goes on in the UN and anti-Semitism, and where anti-Israel sentiment becomes anti-Semitism, and where it doesn't as well. But I think that we need to take that step back and look at the different parts of the UN, the UN member states, the main UN bodies, the UN independent experts, the UN world conferences, the UN funds, programs and agencies, and understand what's going on in order then to work with them to address and tackle the problem. And we have to bear in mind the history. If for decades the discourse has been changed at the UN, Zionism as racism, settler colonialism, apartheid state, all of these, then it's going to take more than a few months to unpack and change that discourse. And it's about working with the right people, because many people in the UN would think that they're not anti-Semitic. Like many people on the left think they're not anti-Semitic and want to counter anti-Semitism in the forms that they understand. But it's about addressing the problems of what anti-Semitism looks like outside of daubing swastikas onto a building, or marching, doing Nazi salutes, and trying to work with people to see how to address the other forms of anti-Semitism that have actually become part of their culture and discourse.
We have an anonymous questioner. He feels the UN appears impotent in its efforts to achieve peace, or at least a cessation of hostilities. So what can it do to prevent the current conflict escalating and spreading? This viewer says it's looking more and more like a proxy war between the US and Iran.
The UN is impotent to the UN is impotent in the face of wars all over the world. From the outset of the UN, at the war in Korea, we had the Cold War, we had the war, look at Pakistan and India and what happened in terms of how many people were killed and displaced, just in terms of decolonization. The UN's primary purpose is to prevent another world war, and it's managed to do so, just about, throughout its history. The UN is not succeeding in preventing regional wars in the Middle East or West Asia, however you want to call it, for many years. I mean, look at what's going on in Syria. Look at what's gone on in Iraq. Look at the regime in Iran and the failures of the international community to support Iranians, let alone what's happened under the Taliban the first time round and now is happening again. The UN does fail on that level. But when you think about what is the UN, it's the 193 member states, and there has to be enough care and attention from them to want to change it. Countries like Uruguay and Argentina are more worried about what's going on in El Salvador and Honduras and Mexico and Colombia right now than they are about what's going on in Israel or Syria or Iran. the Europeans are much more concerned about what's going on in Ukraine, certainly the Western Europeans, because we all worry about what affects us immediately and in our borders. In Australia or New Zealand, they're much more worried about the threat of nuclear weapons from North Korea than they are about those in Iran, because the ones in North Korea can reach them. The ones in Iran are much further away. So we might be focusing and honing in on this region, and thinking that the UN's failed because it's failing to stop war there. But other countries and other regions will be focusing on failures elsewhere. Ultimately, the UN has not failed because there's not been another world war. It might sound like a low base, but I'm sure that for my grandparents, whose parents fought in the First World War, and then my grandparents suddenly were in the middle of the Second World War, it's not a low base that their great-grandchildren have lived without another world war in that time. It depends who you think the UN is and what you expect the UN to do about it. Now, I know we're running short of time, but a key thing would be to ask the question of what's the purpose of UN peacekeepers? The peacekeepers in Lebanon have done absolutely nothing, and yet the Irish are still saying, well, the peacekeepers should remain there, even though the likelihood is that they're going to get caught in the crossfire. We can criticize aspects of the UN in the Middle East, but I don't think we can call it a failure for not preventing war in the Middle East, because its job isn't to prevent cross-border war. Its job is to prevent world war.
A question about the hostages. What can be done to gain the release of the hostages? Does the UN have a role?
I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that, Jonathan. I really do. You know, I don't have an answer to that at all. The hostages are being used as a weapon of war and as a way to negotiate something. I don't think it's a ceasefire. We've seen hostages taken in very many situations, but particularly the taking of hostages within this particular region. I don't have an answer to that, but I wish I did.
What might Israel do to reduce the conflict while still having regard for its legitimate security?
Again, I think it depends who the government is at any given time in Israel. I'm not Israeli. I don't get to vote for the government, and if I was ever a member of the government, then God help us all of any government. But I don't think there will be peace and security in the region until there are two states with secure borders. And the reason I say that is that both sets of people have the right of self-determination, but more than that, until there is a Palestinian state with sovereignty, terrorism will take hold. And you can't negotiate with terrorists, and you can't hold terrorists to set the same standard of account that you can other states. And until the Palestinians have their own state and their own right of self-determination and their own governments that can be held account in the international arena, then we won't have lasting peace.
Now, you may well believe that. The majority of Israelis don't, and the majority of Palestinians don't. So is there realistic hope it's going to happen?
I don't believe polls and surveys about the majority of this and the majority of that. I remember a time when the polls said that we were not going to leave the European Union, or that Donald Trump wasn't going to be elected. Right. So I think that polls only show what people want to tell you, a small subsection who were polled at any given time. I also don't think that you can poll people living under a terrorist regime, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza, and expect them to give you an honest answer. Because really, if I was living under that regime, I'd just be more concerned about not having my child's head cut off. So I'm not very interested in the polls. I'm interested in human behavior. Human behavior is very much that people want to have a nice life, maybe get married, maybe have children, maybe eat nice food, maybe go to sleep at night safely. And I say this not just about Israel and Palestine. I say this having worked in all sorts of conflicts around the world. What people want is just a little bit of peace in their own homes and their own lives, to just get on with sending their kids to school, and my parents' case, having some bees and honey, other people's cases, going on a nice holiday. the only way to do that in this region, whether it's in Syria or Iraq or Palestine, is to remove the radical Islamist terrorists by making sure that there are legitimate states. If you go into Ramallah, it's a beautiful city. And it's being run in a way that, yeah, there might be a little bit, not quite B'nai Brak style of women being oppressed, but it's not so terrible compared with what's gone on in Gaza or what's gone on, under ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa. And why is that? Because of stability, a bit of money, and giving people the right of self-determination. Without giving Palestinians or anyone that right, we allow terrorists, and very often male terrorists, to take hold. So I think we've tried it all other ways. Maybe now is the time to try the way of having a two-state solution. And you know what? If people like me are wrong, then we won't be in any worse position than we are currently.
Well, that's an interesting point to draw our conversation to a close. Rosa, thank you very much for being our guest and for sharing your insight with us. The Routledge books, of which Rosa is one of the editors, are available on Amazon and from other good booksellers. And to say thank you, I'm sending you my pictures of the Israeli citizens' diversity, which hopefully you will enjoy. You'll get that in the next few days. Now, Milim is back on the 21st of October with another visit from the inimitable Tony Zendel. He is speaking about Jews in space. And then on the 28th of October, John O'Ellison is our guest. He and I will be discussing his world record breaking taxi ride and his walking along the River Wharfe, both subjects he's written books about. To be sure you find out about all our events, please visit milim.org.uk and sign up to our newsletter. All online events are free, but you can make a donation to help with our costs. There's a link in the chat now, or visit our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Rosa Freedman, once again. Thank you so much, Rosa. And looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.